So welcome back. We will resume the discussion and now entering into the session dealing with structural changes and public policies. So historically, in most developed countries, structural transformation of the economy have transferred resources from the agricultural sector to the industry and the services sectors. So the industrial sector is playing a specific role in the classical development models, being the engine of growth, the source of high productivity gains and of wage employments. In certain regions, such as in sub-Saharan Africa, structural changes seem to have bypassed the industrial sector, given that manufacturing activities have never been really developed. So is that the symptom of underdevelopment or the early stage of new development pathway in the spirit of the discussion we had yesterday on post-development issues? If industrialization was still the preferred development pathways option, how development countries would catch up while mitigating CO2 emissions and preserving environment? What is the role of social construct in the definition of new development pathways? What is the role of technology? So this session on structural changes and public policy will address these questions. It will provide an economic and institutional vision on the low carbon transition, questioning the interaction between social dynamics, sectoral emergence, innovation, and the role of public policy in different contexts. So three distinguished speakers will give us their view on structural changes and public policy. I'm happy to welcome Dr. Sébastion Treyer, Executive Director of IDRI, the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, Dr. Elvis Avenyo, Senior Researcher at the University of Johannesburg, and Professor Reinette Oonsie from Stellenbosh University. So welcome you all. I will first give the floor to Sébastien. He will open this discussion by questioning whether policy is a lever of transformation or a factor of status quo, and how to trigger regime change. He will highlight that the capacity to debate is crucial to rebuild national pathways, challenge dominant narratives in global value chain, and unlock structural transformation. Sébastien, the floor is yours for 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this invitation. Sorry, I'm just struggling with the PowerPoint. I hope you will be able to see it in full screen in a minute. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to be in this panel with so distinguished speakers from South Africa. I will, as you said, Hélène, really focus the idea on where do we see policies and the development of policies in the issue of structural transformation. And I will base majorly my examples on, or my presentation on, in the field of science and technology studies, the sociology of innovation and transition management, because I think we have a lot to learn from it. And the presentation is structured in two parts. First, a part that is really looking at how in many contexts, in particular in industrialized countries, policies are part of the problem. Policies are, I mean, not saying that we don't need policies, of course, this is not my point, but saying that policies are locking us in. Some of the policies, and I mean, notoriously, the common agricultural policy in Europe is one of the policies that we are not able to really reform to provoke the change that is necessary. But I will introduce some notions about socio-technical regime that I think are extremely important, and also to see how, to what extent, discussing future pathways of development is absolutely important. Then in the second part, I will try to say, in countries or contexts where, because of structural adjustment or because of other reasons, policies are not well developed, the state apparatus is not well developed. How do we see the future? To what extent can we build new policies and new narratives and new pathways? And how can we get inspired, nevertheless, by the context that I will have described on industrialized countries? So some lessons from the sociology of innovation or transition studies about policy change. But this representation is often considered not very readable, but I think it's a very important step in the understanding of what we can know of past socio-technical transitions. It's a paper by Geers and Schott in 2007 that has been heavily discussed in the field of sensor technology studies. Nevertheless, what I think is very important is the notion of a socio-technical regime that is self-reinforcing, meaning there is a path dependency in innovation pathways where we produce always more of the same type of innovation and are locked in a type of solution and unable to find new solutions because the whole innovation regime is excluding some of the innovations because there is a self-reinforcement of the access to financial resources, political resources, the way norms and standards are set is all favoring one specific type of innovation. So that's basically my short summing up of this multi-level perspective by Geers and Schott. And one of the things you see on this graph is that policies are part of what is self-reinforcing. I think this is really extremely challenging when we think of the fact that if we want to stay within planetary boundaries, structural change in major socio-technical systems like the agri-food system, the transportation system, or the energy systems are absolutely necessary. So I would like to argue that existing policies are part of the lock-in, and we are not just asking the questions, can we build transition policies to change our technical systems? But can we really think how we need to change policies if we want structural transformation to happen, meaning structural transformation of these socio-technical systems to sustainability? And I think you probably hear that I'm using structural transformation in a very polysemic way. The way it's used in this conference is majorly about structural transformation of the economy, but I'm also thinking that we need to really be agile in the way we think of that, with the relevant concepts to deal with that, and the idea that we need also structural transformation in those technical systems that are driving, that are very central to our economies. So what I want basically to say in this slide is we need to challenge existing policy frameworks, but also the way constituencies are organized around those policies, because to some extent they are very central to the way that we are not able to change our socio-technical systems. What is the solution generally proposed by transition management? People like Loorbach. So it's a field that is very present in the Dutch context, particularly. I just want to say that generally what we know about transitions are about past transitions, which means that we don't have really a solution about how to really intentionally pilot transitions. But what we understand from the field of transition management is if we want to trigger regime change, it's not easy that we are sure to govern transition, but we need to do at least two things: nurture niche innovations, the ones that are on the bottom side of this graph, the innovations that are for when a regime is dominant, these innovations that are excluded from really upscaling. We need to nurture them to give them more resources, but we also need to organize a debate on future scenarios, because it's not sure that we know which is the niche innovation that would be really delivering, for instance, on sustainability in the longer term future. And this is the recommendation by these scholars, to organize a pluralistic debate between the different types of innovations. I think it's very important to understand that the pluralism of the debate is extremely important, not only because it's performative, because if you've been participating to a debate with a variety of stakeholders, different innovators, then there is more ownership of the transition pathway that might emerge, that might in the end challenge the dominant regime and enable a reconfiguration of this innovation regime. But it's also that you will be able to have some kinds of convergence of anticipations and aspirations of how innovators, of how stakeholders are thinking about the long-term future. And although a pluralistic debate might be trapped in contradictions and controversies, my stance is, as what I understand from this field of literature, is that because there is a pluralistic debate, this is the best way to ensure stability and predictability for investors, rather than having only one scenario. And this is a very important stance. Last thing, the last element I want to bring to the discussion on these lessons from innovation studies, particularly centered on industrialized contexts, is the idea that it's very good to say we will have a pluralistic debate between different futures, different possible scenarios, but there are actually power imbalances within the field of futures, between futures. And so there are dominant futures and alternative futures. If you look at the work by Sheila Jazanoff on imaginaries, or in the French context, socio-technical promises by Pierre-Benoît Joly, they show how some narrative or innovation pathways are very efficient in excluding or silencing other potential innovations. So this is just because we are in a conference with where we probably also discuss a lot of economic modeling. It's not the same to do forecasting and backcasting scenarios with modeling. Very often, it's the business as usual modeling with variance seems more credible than building a backcasting exercise with structural changes and transformation. Very often, you don't have a model to really represent those structural changes in an economy or in a system. And this is something that the team of University of Cape Town in the network that is involved in deep decarbonization pathways has developed some type of alternative modeling for or alternative scenarios with modeling and quantifications for South Africa already before 2015. And I think this is something that we need to bear in mind. You need to also think of the equipment to challenge the dominant narratives and dominant scenarios. The other point that I think is important that there are critical indicators of strong sustainability that are often invisibilized by the dominant modeling framework. We at IDRI have been working, for instance, on how could we represent the performances of agroecological innovation pathways to ensure food security, biodiversity protection, and climate protection. And we've been insisting a lot on trying to discuss how we can model, represent the biodiversity impact of agricultural transformation pathways, or the importance of the variable of labor intensity in farming that is extremely important. And we have had a discussion with the dominant integrated assessment models, like the ones developed at IASA and others, and they confess that they cannot represent biodiversity as a production factor or labor intensity in farming. So these critical elements of performance that we need to get to look at are actually invisibilized by the dominant modeling framework. And there is a whole discussion on how we can really engage in putting those indicators more on the table, either as a separate parallel discussion to the integrated assessment models, or by trying to improve modeling frameworks. So there is some asymmetry in the burden of proof and burden of credibility. For instance, I've been already in 2009 participating to modeling exercises globally about how to feed the world in 2050, trying to challenge the assumption that we need to double food production, because this was really only the productivity narrative, and there was no demand management in the discussion. And this is something that where you really struggle a lot to. The recent developments, for instance, with the war in Ukraine, show to what extent this dominant narrative comes really very easily back, although there are lots of inconsistencies of not looking at the demand side of things. But there is much less proof expected from those who say we need to feed the world by 2050 and thus double food production. This is a narrative that dominates, again, the European context, for instance. So this is the end of my first part, and I need to really get to my second part for the last five minutes, if I'm right, Hélène. There is a whole issue about how do we challenge the incumbent regime and its policies, which needs that we need to equip and support the development of counter scenarios and counter expertise to build a new narrative with credibilizing them with numbers, but also navigating at the same time the political economy and the windows of opportunity to make a new narrative exist. This is something that we have discussed with the colleagues of Meridian Economics in South Africa. Again, I'm using these South African examples because my co-panelists are from South Africa, but this is also not specifically that. It's also because I think there was very interesting lessons from that part. And so Meridian Economics was one of the producers of scenarios for what would be a just energy transition pathway in South Africa. And I understand that there was also, for instance, another scenario that has been developed by NBI, the Business Association. So this plurality existed, and I think it was extremely important. And this report by Meridian for this UCAMA platform on think tanks, European and African think tanks on the sustainability transformation, shows to what extent you cannot think of developing these scenarios without understanding how they fit into the changes in the political economy between players, if you want at some point new scenarios to come to existence. So this is all very good. I've been talking a lot about the European context. I've been showing, you need probably to trust me, but there are interesting examples in the South African context. But these are all contexts where policies are well developed. The state, the data are there to support policies. So when policies, visions, and scenarios are to some extent not developed, does this mean that there are no incumbent narratives and regimes? My message is that probably there are lots of existing or implicit narratives and some kind of a socio-technical regimes that exist, probably in the culture of civil servants in policies, for instance. So probably the idea is that if we want to enable the pluralistic debate on what is the structural transformation of the economy when industrialization as we know it in other contexts is not going to be the same type of development pathways, probably it's very important to not just think that we need to build the vision for the future of the country, but explore multiple scenarios. So of course we need national development plans with data, statistics, modeling that are able to represent the transformation, the structural transformations that we are talking about, but also we need independent expertise to feed the policy debate on long-term scenarios and on looking at path dependencies, transition risks, etc., that are extremely important. The deep decarbonization pathways network that I've been presenting with this example of the 2015 report by the University of Cape Town is also now developing a whole exercise in Senegal to discuss the transformation pathway of the energy system in Senegal and how this is linked to the economic structural transformation of Senegal itself, and lead, if possible, to just energy transition partnerships. And there is a whole political pressure to see to what extent we have time in Senegal for a pluralistic debate on the role of gas in this transition pathway, for instance, while there is a lot of political pressure. So the timeline of political economy and its change is extremely important. And I think even if in context where we might believe that there is what we need to build is the vision for the future, there are dominant narratives that need to be challenged, and we need to make space for niche innovations to unfold. In the 2 minutes that I have still, something that is, I think, very important is to look also beyond policies, because very often what we see is that national policies are extremely important, but global value change actually govern the future of some of these developments. And major lock-ins might come from global value change themselves. And this is, if you, on top of that, look at how the competition between EU, China, and the US on developing industrial policies in their recovery plans is probably going to have a very important effect on the potentialities for industrialization pathways in African countries. Look at the examples about green hydrogen and how Europe wants to import green hydrogen for its own sake, but at the same time, the promises that this would lead to industrialization pathways in Namibia, for instance. We need to really understand the interactions between these industrial policies and the way that these global value chains are going to unfold. Global value chains that I think are not really governed by trade policies or investment policies. So it's not only policies that matter, but the way the contracts between the private players are developing in those global value chains. And you probably see that there are in those global value chains dominant narratives. I just quote a few about the fact that you can only develop through specialization and economies of scale, that the investments need to be very capital intensive, and that there is a zero, and these are not linked with one another. It's not necessarily consistent narratives, but another one that is that there is a zero-sum game on reshoring jobs and friendshoring supplies. That means that if we have jobs in Namibia, industrial jobs in Namibia, they will not be in Europe about green steel, for instance. So how can we question this fact that global value chains are a zero-sum game. There might be alternative scenarios about added value capture, about labor intensity and not only capital intensity, about diversification and economies of scope rather than economies of scale. But these dominant narratives need to be also represented in scenarios. So this is my conclusion. We need to really develop to see how we could, if we want structural transformation to happen, meaning both the economic structural transformation that Hélène has been hinting at in the beginning, but also the system transformation of these socio-technical regimes that are at the heart of our economies. And for instance, the energy system of Senegal is already such a socio-technical regime, and we need to really see how to both develop access to energy and at the same time change the narrative within the energy system. Then we need probably to ensure that we have contextualized innovation and contextualized long-term pathways in the discussion, which means reinforcing national research and innovation systems, ensure some type of strategic niche management in countries, and ensure a pluralistic debate on long-term pathways. So, last word, challenging dominant narratives is very important in national context, but also in global value chains. And for that regard, we really need to ensure that local national operators are considered as innovators themselves in those value chains, and not just that innovation is coming from somewhere else. And this is very central in what we experienced at IDRI with other colleagues when we try to observe the African Union, European Union partnership of equals, while we have such very important imbalances in economic power, where I think it's not just about a battle of trade rules, how the Green Deal is going to be a trade barrier for exports from African countries, but really also a battle of narratives. How can we build narratives together that are really leading to global value chains or to value chains across the two continents that are building more capacity for industrialization in a very new way, in a leapfrogged way for African countries. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm really pleased to continue the discussion with the co-panelists. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Sébastien. And you had even 50 seconds time remained if you wanted to take it. And thank you for remembering that structural change is not only economic, but in a more holistic way, and it will echo other presentation. I pass now the floor to Elvis Avenyo. So with a senior researcher at the Center for Competition, Regulation and Economic Development at the University of Johannesburg. His research focuses on development economics with interest in innovation, technologies, industrial development, labor market, firm behavior with a focus on developing countries, And he will tackle here the issue of restructuring for sustainable industrialization in Africa. Elvis, the floor is yours for 20 minutes.
Thanks, Hélène, and thanks for the introduction also. And of course, thanks also to Fiona for the opportunity also to share some of our work with the participants of the conference today around issues looking at how particularly African countries are restructuring their economies to sort of leverage the opportunities emerging in the global system or the global transformation that we see today, or what the sort of things they should be doing, right? And we look at some of the policy imperatives that we do see emerging from some of our work. You've already touched on some of my preliminary points, so I'm going to skip them, but I would want to sort of re-emphasize a point made by Sébastien regarding the fact that structural transformation or structural change is not automatic, and also not costless, but it's quite a complex process that requires sort of a long-term overview of the historical facts. And then this also requires sort of an understanding of the institutions, the organizations, as well as the political economy of specific countries. So what I'm trying to say here is simply that the contention is that we need industrial policy, but also that the state has a big role to play, contrary to sort of some of the views that we do see from the liberal views. And of course, we do need some flexibility in these industrial policies, but as well as in the role of the state to change themselves as sort of countries grow, right? So I think that sort of the composition of output and employment of key sectors are quite important, and these compositions often give us what is important. So if a question is asked, what is essential, particularly from a sort of a productivity standpoint, we can actually just use data to sort of answer that question. And we've seen a lot of work around some of these issues already. And one of the key things I imagine is the fact that industrial policy is linked directly to sort of industrialization. And I think some of these points also came out earlier. So the special role of industrialization is quite known, I believe, and these sort of largely dwells or comes from the Calderian and the structuralist approaches, and emphasizing the key role industrialization plays, particularly in establishing backward and forward linkages, but also sort of fostering a technological investment. And we do know from history, particularly from the advanced countries and the newly advanced countries, particularly from East Asia, that some of these evidence are quite clear. And also, of course, the case of China is quite unique, right? With China becoming sort of the world's factory and sort of leapfrogging most of the sort of traditionally advanced countries by capturing majority of manufacturing output, but not only that, sort of capturing majority of the gains in manufacturing. So we do see sort of some of these a large consensus on the role of industrialization. So then a key question that keeps emerging is why then have other emerging countries in Latin America, in particular also in Africa, sort of failed to industrialize or probably failed to transform their economies into more sustainable industrialization paths. And I contend here that it is mainly due to the neglect of production and sort of a shift more towards exchange of and trade of goods and services. And I give sort of a historical account here in terms of what happened after the World War II in Europe, where we saw the Marshall Plan sort of helping to reconstruct Europe, particularly Western Europe. But then also how at independence, most African countries sort of integrated or probably emphasized the role of production industrial policy in their development path. But of course, we do know down the line, due to internal and external factors, we do see some new sort of liberal policies emerging in ways that emphasized exchange of trade and goods more. And also, of course, these issues were also due to the fact that some of the government policies in some of these countries failed. So we see new liberal policies around the structural transformation adjustment programs. We see the economic recovery programs emerging that essentially sort of shifted the focus from production to trade. And then we do see an interesting case during that period where the East Asian countries largely remained sort of focused on and emphasizing production. And there is some literature that indicates that is one of the core reasons why these countries were able to sort of develop and industrialize and was able to catch up. So today we do see generally that there is sort of a historical disproof of some of these liberal policies, and we do see increasingly the re-emergence of production, right? So we do see sort of industrial policy largely coming back, and we do see as well some of these policies being integrated into development policies, particularly on the African continent. We've seen the AU Agenda 2063 that emphasizes largely the role of sort of industrialization in engendering sort of structural change and transformation in Africa. So then the question also is, how come the structure of most of these economies have remained the same? This data is pretty old, but I think it just highlights the point that if you compare majority of these emerging countries, and particularly Brazil and South Africa here, we do see that across all the indicators of industrialization, they are underperforming. And in certain cases, even deindustrializing. And even if you just simply take the sort of the product space sort of concept and compare across some of the emerging economies, you do see that the most industrialized country in Africa, which is South Africa, is less connected across its products, but also less competitive. And then also it points also that the structure itself in South Africa hasn't changed much. It's still an economy that is heavily reliant on the minerals and raw materials, but also we do see that quite clearly post sort of democracy, the structure hasn't changed much. Like it's largely remained the same. So these sort of questions raises these sort of points raises very fundamental questions, particularly now that we do see imperatives around industrialization, which is really emerging, but as well as some of the climate conditions and some of the climate discussions that are emerging. So there are sort of some of these sort of Mazzucato sort of refers to them as wicked challenges that are confronting sort of developing countries today, and we do see the sort of the climate crisis. We do see the opportunities and challenges emerging from the fourth industrial revolution, but as well as also sort of the demographic explosions that majority of emerging economies are experiencing. So she advocates largely that some of these issues need huge and grand thinking, largely led by sort of an entrepreneurial state that is based on research, right? Like a policy that's also largely linked to going to the moon and sort of the book written by Richard Nelson around the ghetto, sort of the moon and the ghetto, sort of trying to emphasize how public policy could have huge roles in resolving some of the grand challenges that we are facing today. So I think what I want to do probably in the next minutes that I have is to sort of try to see or probably explain how some of these issues are becoming sort of a dilemma, particularly for emerging economies. On the one hand, to industrialize, but also on the other hand, to do this sort of sustainably. And we do see some of these dual goals in most of the policies that developing countries are coming up with these days. And particularly also in South Africa, where we do know that it generates majority of its power or electricity from coal. So the issues are not lightly, and the issues are not being taken lightly, given that South Africa is also facing now huge sort of power supply issues. So what we try to do in a paper I worked on with Fiona is trying to see how industrialization, which is pretty much established in the literature, influences the climate crisis here, emissions. But specifically, we are looking at how some of these effect is moderated by the tech intensity of manufacturing. And what we try to do here is simply to look at some of these issues across some 68 emerging and developing economies, and also trying to just decompose what we mean by industrialization into low and medium tech manufacturing. So the key result that we identified from our analysis does show that there is a higher or rephrasing that there is we do see that manufacturing does actually pollute the environment. But we do see that the level of tech intensity of this of the manufacturing process matters, and we do see largely here that countries that tend to emphasize and sort of specialize in medium and high tech manufacturing processes tend to mitigate the climate crisis better than those who emphasize the low tech manufacturing processes. And of course, a direct policy recommendation that is it, and policymakers often like this. Okay, then let's focus on building medium and high tech manufacturing. But of course, we do know as well that these development processes are not direct, and these development processes are not automatic. And the fact that it is difficult, particularly for developing countries, actually to specialize in some of these processes because they lack the investment, but as well as the the productive capabilities that they require in order to build some of these manufacturing processes. All right, so to sort of conclude, I think it is important for countries to recognize that developing countries particularly face issues around late industrialization. But not only that, there are also certain countries like Brazil and South Africa that are trying to re-industrialize in several other ways. But the challenges are still quite enormous, and we do see increasingly, for instance, that the CBAM policies that are being instituted by the EU in a way to mitigate the climate crisis in several ways also threatens some of the root industries that generate growth in these countries. So often we do sort of advocate for a mixed climate, but also sort of industrial mix where the current realities of these countries are taken into consideration, but as well as some of the opportunities that are emerging around the fourth industrial revolution, and how countries can sustainably shift into some of the new technologies that are less emitting. We do know that some of these processes are not automatic. They require learning, they require building productive capabilities, and they require investment, but more importantly, they require very active industrial policy. And I think that these issues, some of these points are also lacking in developing countries. So we do see some opportunities emerging, particularly around regional value chains. And in the context of the African continental free trade, we do see huge opportunities, particularly in ways that one pushes back on some of the green standards that are emerging, but also creating markets and opportunities for African firms and African countries to leverage on leverage some of the opportunities they have regarding climate. So an example I want to give here simply, it's about the cocoa value chain. What we do see is the fact that there are only two countries produce about 75% of the cocoa beans, for instance, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire. And the way that the value chain is structured now is simply the fact that small amounts of the cocoa beans are exported to Egypt and South Africa, but the rest of the chunk of it are exported outside of the continent. And this enables them to sort of capture only a small proportion of the value of 9 billion, whilst sort of the entire value chain is around 112 billion. What we do see is that South Africa and Egypt do have some productive capabilities to actually produce chocolates, but this is not done. So an opportunity here around regional value chain is simply to sort of build capabilities in ways that retain some of the opportunities of production, but as well as sort of value addition on the continent. And I think that sort of thinking around industrial policy from a regional lens often adds value to some of the discussions we are having. And of course, if you integrate the climate crisis into the issues, we do know some of the difficulties that Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire are facing, particularly in terms of pollution and climate. And so there are cases where certain countries may need to come in on board to produce some of these products. So I think regional opportunities are quite important when countries want to structurally transform. Yes, Hélène, I would like to end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elvis. You are reaffirming the role of industry and the role of industrial policy and of technology, and you are mentioning the way of, reforming the value chain, echoing what Sébastien had just said. Thank you very much. So we are coming to the third presentation. I would like to remind to the public online, don't hesitate to begin to ask your question online. We will take the Q&A after Oonsie's presentation. So now the floor is to Dr. Reinette Oonsie-Biggs. She holds the South African Research Chair in Social-Ecological System and Resilience. She is co-director of the Center for Complex System in Transition at Stellenbosh University, and she also holds a joint appointment at the Stockholm Resilience Center. So Oonsie is as well the co-founder of the initiative Seeds of Good Anthropocenes, which goal is to explore and start developing a narrative around what different good Anthropocenes might be like in different regions and at different scales. So she will now present this initiative. Oonsie, the floor is yours for 20 minutes. Or even more, because we are a little bit ahead of the time. So if you want to take 3 extra minutes, it's okay as well.
I'll try to stick to my little slot. But thanks so much. And yeah, I think my presentation maybe comes from a slightly different angle. I'm a social ecological system scientist, kind of working at the interface of ecology and kind of various social sciences. But I think this initiative that I'm going to speak about today is one that comes out of this community and really based on work that's been done around future scenarios, but also taking very much a complex adaptive systems kind of approach. And I think it has some really nice resonances with the two interventions before me. So I think as everyone at this conference is aware, and why we're all engaging in these discussions, is that I think it's very clear that the current trajectory of change, both environmentally and socially, that we're on cannot be sustained. And there's this, I think, emerging kind of urgency and imperative around transformational change, and an acknowledgement that this needs to occur across multiple interconnected sectors to address multiple interconnected challenges across multiple scales. So it's actually an enormously complex kind of imperative that we face over the probably the next decade. However, what form this sustainable future might take, I think, is actually still quite unclear. And in some way, we haven't been that imaginative about what such a transformed world could look like. And I think it very much speaks to this kind of issue or problem that we often get very trapped in the kinds of ways that the world is working at present, and in the dominant narratives around what a good future looks like. And it's actually quite difficult to think outside of that. So this initiative around the Seeds of Good Anthropocenes is really trying a little bit to tackle this challenge, and it does so in a particular way. So the goal of this initiative is to explore and start developing a narrative, not just about what one good future could look like, but really what different good futures could look like in different regions and at different scales. And I think we've been particularly interested in capturing some alternative perspectives from sort of non-dominant regions and groups that maybe can provide us some kind of alternative imaginaries for what a good future might look like. Just a little bit as background, this initiative sort of formally started in 2014 and was initially funded under the Future Earth Initiative as a fast-track initiative. But I think it's really kind of taken hold in a way as like little seeds that grow almost in our metaphor. And it's now being kind of taken forward through various funding streams by different groups around the world in this kind of loose collaborative network. So maybe just a little of background in terms of the thinking behind it. So quite a bit of it is also informed by psychological and management research around the importance of these inspirational visions. And I think this also resonates with some of what Sébastien was bringing up, that in order to bring about this deep systemic change, we need some of these kind of inspirational visions that can really kind of help pull us there almost and guide us. And I also really like this quote that we've paraphrased from Alex Evans, coming a little bit more out of the future space, but also highlighting, just the importance of these stories or narratives in the sense that they actually help create our reality as much as they explain it. And I particularly like this kind of contrast between, if we have these stories about the world basically falling apart, which is actually a very dominant kind of narrative within more of the kind of environmental and ecology space, then as these kind of challenges and breakdowns are hitting us, the way that we make sense of it is that we tell them, this is exactly, we're on this pathway to the world falling apart. Whereas if we can have some of these stronger visions and stories that tell us actually we're on this way to a better future potentially, but we might be going through rough kind of patches in the journey to get there because of these deep structural changes that need to occur, they can actually help us respond in ways that then actually use those changes to create the future. And so it's sort of this acknowledgement that as agents, we're part of this complex, adaptive co-creation of the future, and that we need to kind of position ourselves in our thinking in that way, even if we don't know exactly what this future is, but that we're actively helping shape it. And in terms of sort of the underlying premise for the project, and this is just about sort of thinking about the extent of change, and I feel that often, at least in some kind of spheres of discussion, I think when we're talking about kind of more sustainable futures, my feeling is that it's often people are actually just imagining kind of tweaks to the current system, maybe a little bit biggish tweaks, but it's not a fundamental restructuring of like the logic of the system and the underlying values. And so I think our starting point for this project is also kind of emphasizing that in order to meet these sort of enormous challenges around the environmental and social challenges that we face, we probably need a shift on the order of the kind of restructuring of society from kind of agrarian societies to industrial societies, and something quite fundamental that actually is a reshaping of our underlying worldviews about how we understand the world, our place as humans in this world, and the assumption and values that shape our individual choices and overall kind of policies and behavior. So then why do we focus on this idea of seeds is because it's almost impossible to imagine these radically different futures. So I always use the example that if we are someone kind of in medieval agrarian times in Europe to imagine the present, it's impossible. Even if we're thinking we're trying to imagine a different future. So in a sense, if we really are thinking about deep transformative change, our sort of psychologically, our ability to imagine that is really difficult or actually impossible. But we do know that many times these kind of big, complex systemic changes, they don't come from nowhere. They build on things that are in the system already. And so that's where this idea of seeds comes from, that they're these little like experiments, or they can even be quite old ways of doing things, but they're kind of marginal in the system. And that those things then kind of can grow, but especially that they combine in novel ways that maybe create new emergent kind of futures. So this is specifically what we think of as these seeds, or these new ways of thinking, ways of doing things, new types of institutions, technologies, but specifically things that are not dominant. So they're existing on the margin of the current kind of main logic of the systems we live in. And just sort of some brief examples from our project. So I think we're also sometimes still debating what exactly is a seed or not a seed. And even that is quite an interesting kind of conceptual debate in terms of what are things that are actually potentially transformative. But I think some of the examples we often think about are some of these kind of new community currencies, different kind of land ownership models, maybe different ways of industrial production and how the benefits get shared, and also different ways of doing agriculture and who participates in those. I'll just briefly step through this kind of theory of change which underlies our work, and you will recognize some elements from the framework that Sébastion presented. So this framework that we've developed for this project actually combines some of the social ecological transformations kind of theories of change with the socio-technical transitions. So essentially, it thinks about this change happening at these different micro to macro scales, as Sébastion also pointed out, but also thinking about these different phases of change. So in this very first phase, which is one that we're kind of focusing on, we think about these little marginal activities or seeds that are inspired by this kind of emerging kind of meta narrative around the need for systemic change. And then it fuels these on the ground experiments. And we actually find I think this was also been fun with this project, is that when you start looking around, there are tons of these little innovations and experiments going on. And that these experiments themselves then further fuel this narrative and how we imagine it. But then I think from a lot of kind of complex systems theory also, in order to actually have these kind of alternative ways of doing things become established as a mainstream, you need some kind of opportunity context where there's a space in the system to embed those. And often it happens through a process where, for instance, some of what we're calling these seeds might combine into what they call these proto-regimes. So it's a constellation of a few different elements of things that start forming a proto-alternative system. And that when there's often some kind of crisis or breakdown in the current structures, this kind of proto-regime can get partly institutionalized. But then even at that level where maybe it becomes adopted in a particular city or maybe even at a country level, the ability for that kind of alternative way of doing things to actually become established at a broader level is still quite tricky, because you often have dominant forces that, almost kind of squeeze out or gobble up these new innovations, or sometimes they just get stuck and they don't spread further. So in terms of thinking really about kind of deep systemic transformation at the global level, it's actually, these things also, they need to spread in different ways in a much wider and bigger way. So then I'll just say a few words about how we're thinking about operationalizing this theory of change. So as I've mentioned, the first component is really around identifying and collecting these examples of these innovations. And we've been archiving them on this website, which also in the process, again, of updating. But we've also actually run quite a few stakeholder dialogues. We had some nice funding in South Africa and did some around the country, but also in East Africa. And those were really, I think really interesting and valuable dialogues for trying to think about what are some initiatives that already exist. And as I mentioned before, as I think once one starts thinking about it, you actually realize there's quite a lot of the stuff happening, which is quite inspiring. Then I think a second really important component in terms of also thinking how change happens is about creating these spaces where different seeds or different innovations can connect and learn from each other. But it's also in terms of thinking around these ideas of fostering this kind of these proto-regimes. And I think we now have a new IDRC funded project that we're really focusing on that in terms of the food system and trying to think about how do we also connect people that are working at very different spaces, maybe in the food chain, to actually kind of connect together, to put together kind of alternative ways of doing things at like a more systemic level. And we know that these kind of proto-regimes or shadow kind of networks are really important in thinking about larger transformative change, and that's like a process within this preparation phase that is really critical. And then the third part that we've actually spent quite a bit of time on is developing these future visions or scenarios. And we drew on this existing method called the Manoa method that looks for these weak signals. So we thought of these seeds as weak signals, and then basically used a variety of futures methods then to kind of flesh out these scenarios. And just briefly, this future wheels is kind of a core tool that we used, which is basically taking each of these seeds, which are represented in the little yellow block, and then thinking, okay, if this little seed was not just like a little marginal experiment, but as actually the mainstream way of doing things, what would the world look like at the immediate level? And then like the red ring is like the sort of second order impacts of that. And then we think about how different seeds can combine. So that's in this picture is having these three different kinds of seeds coming together and then describing an overall different kind of world. And these worlds are quite radically alternative. I must say, it was like from previously doing futures work, these scenarios are definitely more out there than anything I'd worked on before. And that's generally because most of the existing scenarios methods are quite focused on the big existing drivers of change. So you kind of get locked into thinking according to how these big existing forces are shaping the world. So this is kind of a different way of really kind of looking much more into the margins of how things could be. And then there's also, we had quite a focus on these kind of experiential scenario techniques. So actually also getting people to then act out these scenarios and having very diverse groups. So this is actually like a group that put on this kind of show, but it included, quite senior academics and some artists and people also working in, for instance, the UN and some of the governmental agencies. So they were very diverse groups. And yeah, I think maybe also the thing emerging from those scenarios is that people then also really feel that they're quite possible. I think even though they're quite strange scenarios, but because they build on things that already exist, and then it's been a process of actually thinking through how those things could grow and change the world. I think, yeah, they somehow seem more plausible and possible. The last tool I'll just mention is that we've been using this 3 Horizons framework, which I also found has been extremely a valuable tool. And it's also quite intuitive for people to use. So basically, the first focus we have is basically looking at these little pockets of the future or these seeds in this 3rd horizon and how would they grow. So then we explore these different pathways by which we would get from the current situation to a future where the world is reshaped according to these little initiatives. But then in order to think about how that might happen, we identify what are the current dominant ways of doing things or the ways that the world works and the dominant kind of dynamics, and which of those would need to decline in order to make it possible for these seeds, in a sense, to grow. And then we look at the 2nd horizon, which is really around the transition space, which I think is really the most interesting space. And it's how do we cross that change from these new things becoming dominant to the currently dominant things declining, and then trying to look there for different kinds of leverage points, enabling conditions, barriers, and also I think very importantly potential kind of capture points where the currently dominant forces can kind of almost take back the system and not allow it to transform. So yeah, just to wrap up then some of the emerging insights from the work that we've done, and we've done these scenarios a few times in Southern Africa, but then also in Northern Europe, and now it's also been done in Canada and a couple of other places. But I think there's quite a lot of commonalities, sorry, which could also be around the way that we're doing this. But I think it's also quite interesting what's coming up. So some of the themes that have been coming up repeatedly are around this kind of shift to decentralized participatory decision-making, which is very much enabled by technology. And then also the key role that technology plays in any of these futures. And I think this has been something that's sometimes been a bit difficult for, I think, some kind of environmental people that maybe are less keen on technology to recognize that I think any future really to shift to a more sustainable future, like there's a very critical role for technology there, both in connecting people, but also in reducing environmental impact. There's been a big shift in most of these scenarios about the nature of work. And so the kind of underlying logic of working to pay, and that logic gets broken down. And so that we actually, the economy is structured in a different way so that people are actually contributing to community and living more fulfilling lives, then very much a post-consumerist and collaborative kind of ethic. But then we also identify some risks, and that's really around these entrenched power structures. Then I think a big kind of risk that comes up repeatedly is around these divergent values for different groups of people, both within specific countries and across countries, and how also technology can actually aid, and that's what we're already seeing with social media, aid this kind of polarization and people living in their own kind of bubble. And then obviously beyond that, also other kind of risks associated with technology. And then I think maybe from the philosophers in our group, also asking this kind of more deeper question around whether the Anthropocene or the kind of sustainability challenges that we're facing now actually implies a new kind of role and responsibility for us in terms of thinking what it means to be human in this world that we're living in now, and in the sense the power that we're having in shaping the world that we're living in. And then just my last slide around then identifying some of these potential leverage points from this work. And I think this first one resonates a lot with what you've said, Sébastien, around the importance of these kind of compelling visions to provide this kind of direction for change and innovation, and that they really need to be broadly co-produced and broad-based science-society partnerships to kind of buy into this vision of the future. And it feels like there's still quite a lot of work to do there. Then secondly, kind of a lot of focus on thinking around how do we foster, identify, connect, and support these kind of experimental initiatives that have the potential to help bring about transformative change, and particularly to identify are there kind of key areas of strategic investment that almost they're a bit of like a domino effect. So is there one particular kind of area, and I think a lot of times around energy or some of the kind of key aspects of our kind of current systems, that if you get those changing, they actually kind of domino effect onto other things and precipitate larger kind of cascades of change. And then this issue around really thinking very seriously about what are some of the dominant kind of structural forces, and Sébastien, from your thing, was it the narratives that are blocking change, and how do we actually think seriously about some interventions that can kind of weaken those forces and at the same time kind of support the growth of alternatives. And then sort of linked to that is this importance around exploring and co-developing governance and institutional arrangements that can actually help us navigate these emergent pathways, and especially the change and uncertainty that I think is inevitable to come along with this process of change. And I think very importantly, also from the South African context is, and globally, is, how do we have or facilitate pathways that really facilitate and build greater equity? Because at the moment, I think often things are actually going into more greater inequality kind of directions. And then, just to say, we've got this website with a whole bunch of resources, and keen to chat more. Thanks very much. I think I used my 2 extra minutes.
Thank you very much, Oonsie, for this very inspiring presentation and presenting this initiative, which give a chance, to reset the present and to have a radical change, and showing how it would be feasible. I think that this session has also showed how South Africa was fertile in providing innovative approaches. So thank you for giving us all these presentations. So we will now give the floor to the room and to the people online for a set of questions. We have approximately half an hour. I see a lot of questions. So I will take 3 questions in the room, and after I will pass to the online questions. But in between, you will have a chance to answer. So, who has the mic? Yeah. Etienne. Sorry.
You hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much for these 3 very exciting presentations. I would have a comment or a question for the last presenter, so Mrs. Biggs. So thanks. It was very exciting presentation as well, but I would like to try to challenge it a bit. So usually it's usually said that it's easier to think about the end of the world than to think about the end of capitalism, right? So in your case, you mentioned leverage points, enabling conditions that could help foster this change. So I don't know if the world you present, the ideal world you present, is also compatible with capitalism or not. But I would like to know a bit more about these leverage points or enabling conditions. If we think about how capitalism emerged itself, the leverage points and enabling conditions were quite huge. Discovery of the New World, slave trade, and this kind of things that basically led this enormous transition. So what would be those in this case?
Thank you. Armand.
I have a comment and a question after Sébastien's presentation. I'm Armand Riou de l'Argenté. I'm a retiree from the AFD, and I have focused on agriculture in Brittany, a sector that no doubt Sébastien is quite familiar with. But there is a very interesting example I have found, which is that the key innovation for post-development, if I can say, of agriculture in Brittany was found about 40 or 50 years ago, and yet it is not diffused, not propagating. And the reason is, just to summarize very shortly, that this new model, which is on dairy production, recommends feeding grass to cows instead of feeding concentrates and minerals and soya, things that require expenditure. In other words, the outcome is that the post-development model is one of reducing expenditure. Now, if you reduce expenditure, you're reducing somebody's income. And of course, that somebody is the agro-industry. So my question is not just to Sébastien and the interveners, but maybe to the organizers of this very interesting symposium. Are we addressing the question, which is the question of frugality, sobriété in French, which is going to reduce expenditure? And how do we address that important power problem? Thank you.
Thank you. Benedict.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you. Yes, those were very, very interesting and provocative presentations. As a scenario practitioner, I was delighted to see the emphasis on narratives and the use of future wheels and weak signals and so on. I'm just going to ask. So a lot of this was focused on transformation in lower and middle income countries, in particular a middle income country. But of course, as Elvis pointed out, and also Sébastien, this is within a linked global system. And I guess my question is, what must happen in high-income countries for a sustainable development that will lead to a prosperous and sustainable world in low and middle-income countries? What is needed of people in the high-income countries to do to make that possible?
So thank you. We will. I give the floor to the speaker to answer. So maybe I will take the reverse order. Elvis, do you want to start? And then Oonsie and Sébastien.
Sure. Thanks, Helen. And I'll react quickly to the last question around what advanced countries, developed countries must do. I think, frankly, the first thing they must do is probably to stop the hypocrisy, and try to probably honestly come to the table in ways that we try sort of have a sort of a climate diplomacy for us to be able to solve the climate crisis. I think that is one fundamental thing. Yesterday in the news, it was reported that the UK has actually approved its first coal mine in years. And for me, that is hypocritical, because coming from the COP26 and COP27, that the understanding was that we were moving from fossil fuel towards green technologies, green hydrogen and other things. So reversing and having the political power to reverse to the so-called dirty fuels, while developing countries are being in several other ways squeezed into technologies that they have no idea about. I think that is problematic, and that is hypocritical of the global system and the way that we are trying to resolve the climate crisis. I'll end there.
Thank you. Oonsie, you want to take the floor?
Thank you, and thanks for this interesting questions and discussion. I'll maybe respond to the first one around the leverage points and the kind of changing from capitalism. I think it sounds like maybe the person asking the question may have even better insights than I have. But I feel that's probably the challenge we're all kind of thinking around. Is kind of what are some of these preconditions? and I'd be interested to hear, if other people maybe have also some insights. I know one of the big ones that have come up in South Africa during the COVID pandemic is also kind of more serious engagement with the ideas of maybe having a minimum wage, and how that could actually kind of restructure some of the flows within South Africa in terms of resource flows, and just bring more people kind of into the economy. And I think this kind of links to I think a lot of the questions being asked around around equality, and how do we also in the transition kind of have a democratic and a democratizing kind of pathways of change, and that we actually possibly need to kind of change some of our logics in terms of how resources are allocated and what that means. Because I think the reality is that in a lot of our systems, like large numbers of people are very marginalized. And just last week I went also to an interesting presentation around some of the challenges with urbanization here in the region, and the kind of in many instances, there's really not following the pathway that we've seen elsewhere in the world, with people urbanizing and then becoming wealthier and getting enough resources to enter the formal economy, to get into a housing market, but actually they basically remain stuck very much on the fringes, and that we actually need to potentially think of completely different kind of pathways by which we actually bring people into at least having some kind of stability of income and access to resources to build houses and have education, etc. So I'd be interested also to hear more from the speakers here. I think is very much an area that we're kind of only entering into in kind of the community that I'm largely working in. And then maybe just on the last question around kind of these interconnections between different regions and places in the world. I mean, I think this is really critical. And I say earlier this year or last year, we did also one kind of a little bit more conceptual paper on thinking about, if we have a kind of a global pathway to a sustainability transformation, that, I think often we're thinking that this is one pathway that the whole world is on. But the reality is, all these different regions, they've got different starting conditions, they've got different dynamics, there's also different values. So in a sense, whatever we're going to see at a global level is going to be some emergent outcome of how these different pathways in different regions interact. And I think the key thing there is that, how do we create space for some kind of context-specific different kinds of pathways in different regions, but where those pathways don't come at the expense or compromise the opportunities for other regions, which I think de facto is actually what's been happening in the world to date. And even where there have been sometimes big efforts at kind of reducing environmental impact, it's often even just being about displacing impact to other regions. So I think even, I also saw an interesting analysis around, if one looked around just in terms of these kind of raw materials that are flowing from developing regions into the global economy, such as what Elvis presented. If we actually look at the contribution to developed countries' economies, these products should be being paid for much higher prices. And so in a sense, we're selling them off at these incredibly low prices, but the real value that's being taken out of them is enormous. So it's also, that kind of thinking, I think, that we need to challenge and think a bit about what are the current dynamics of exploitation that's actually just entrenching the current pathway.
Thank you, Oonsie, for this very complete answer. Finally, Sébastien, do you want to add your comments?
Yes, thank you very much. And I really like the conjunction of the three presentations and the questions. I think one of the key elements about high-income countries to me is that we are also renovating the way we look at industrial policies in higher income countries at a pace and in a magnitude that is enormous. I mean, we have this conflict between Japan, South Korea, and Europe on one side, and the US on the other side with their IRA, saying that this is not the rules of the game that we had before. So this is something that is extremely complicated between industrialized countries. And and this will have tremendous effect. I mean, this race to put more money on industrial policies in our developed countries, in our industrialized countries, will have a tremendous effect on the options for industrialization in lower middle income countries. And I think this is not reflected, and we really need to think of how do we coordinate industrial policies. I have a concern, that is that in this competition between US, China, and Europe, to put it bluntly, because of course there are also other Asian powers, economic powers, there will be very little space for Europe, for instance, to really consider how its own development pathway, industrialization pathway, will affect African countries. And I'm actually not as concerned on CBAM as Elvis, although we need to ensure that CBAM is put well. But there are other effects of non-trade policies, like industrial policies in Europe, that are going to be tremendously important, and we really need to coordinate that. My stance when I talk to European players is to say, even for very instrumental and cynical reasons, you need to build a strong alliance and a kind of a solidarity of production with African countries, because else we Europeans are going to be just crushed between US and China. So this is, I'm using very cynical words and not the moral argument, but I think there is something to be explored there. But we see that on green steel, for the moment, there is no narrative that is very convincing for ArcelorMittal to really build on having industrial jobs built up in Southern Africa and then import, and then because they want to have the jobs in Europe. And I believe that this is also about a narrative where what types of jobs do we build? Are they the same? What is the tech intensity, as Elvis has been saying, in both contexts? Because the reindustrialization narrative, the reindustrialization moment is on both sides, and we need to think about that. And coordination is key. If we really are able to build supply chains between the two continents that are not a zero-sum game, but where we have jobs in both sides, is very important. The other thing that I wanted to say is that I'm really completely aligned with the idea put by Oonsie that we need to rethink the future of jobs and the role of employment in prosperity, in the welfare system, etc. And at the same time, I think Elvis told us there are things that do matter. There are a lot of low wages agricultural workers in Africa that need to transition to decent jobs to have an income. And so jobs, we need at the same time to think of jobs having another type of importance in our lives, in our societies, but at the same time to ensure for some millions, if not billions of people in African context, where having a decent job in industry is going to be extremely important. And there is a discrepancy here that is, I think, very important. We need both to think about post-growth and looking at how growth can deliver jobs. And I think this is also something that is going to be extremely important in the way that we can imagine industrialization futures for low and middle income countries. And this is not to say that I'm not looking at the fact that maybe the changes that we are looking at might necessitate a change in the structure of capitalism. But this is where I believe we have already a lot of battles to fight dominant narratives, even if in the background, maybe we need to think that it's the whole structure of capitalism that needs to change. But there are things that we can already do challenging some of the narratives that are, as Armand was saying, the productivity narrative, the fact that in Brittany, modernization needs to be capital intensive, while you actually have other options that are much more sustainable, that are on the sufficiency side of things, where you have less capital intensity. And at the same time, yes, the battle to be fought here is also a battle because some of the dominant rent-centered economic players like the agrochemicals industry, we need to challenge their dominant position, because of course they are their place in the future of an agroecological future there is no space for a rent based on chemicals that have been whose R&D has been developed 40 years ago. It's going to be much more intensive in R&D to think of new ways to make agriculture more sustainable, and so the change in business model is going to be radical for some of the players that are the incumbents of today, and this is the types of battles that we already need to fight in terms of fighting the dominant narratives that are stuck with those types of incumbents. But I think Etienne Espagne is right that we need to also think of how, if we look at the global relations between regions, we will not avoid having to discuss also how the structures of capitalisms is also preventing some of the futures that might be sort of more sustainable, how they could emerge. Thank you.
Thank you, Sébastien. I have a few questions online, so I will try to pick them up. Two of them are from Philippa, and Philippa, I will try to resume them. So the first one is, considering that the future is technological, e.g. the exponential development of artificial intelligence, ought we not embrace technology and integrate it into more grassroots approaches? Is not our future an hybrid one, symbolized by diverse solutions to one challenge? So this is our first question. The second, I would argue that transformation only comes after collapse. For example, structural forces are so embedded in the way we act and think that only their total collapse will pave the way for transformation. Do you agree or not? And I picked the question from Lydia. Agree on the risk, or rather challenges, how to convince the forces embedded in established structure to embrace radical change. So I think maybe Oonsie, you can start answering, and then Sébastien, and Elvis, if you want to add, I will give you the floor also. So Oonsie.
Maybe I'll start with the question around collapse, and maybe my personal kind of view on this. I think the real challenge we face is how do we bring about change without radical collapse? I think in a sense of how do we have a transition that kind of moves us in the direction that we want, that keeps most people okay. Or improving, because I think that, the way the world is unfolding, I think there are quite a lot of potential pathways that could involve quite radical collapse. And I think the long-lasting effects also of that kind of collapse, I think, shouldn't be discounted. And I think we've seen that in many cases. It's not just a matter of collapse and then recovery, that those collapses themselves have very, very long-lasting effects. But also obviously in the moment a lot of people will suffer. So I think the real challenge is, how do we navigate a transition that is going to be, I think, very complex and turbulent with kind of the least damage and the least people in a sense falling off the boat. That I think is the real challenge that we face. Thank you.
Sébastien, you want to pursue?
Yeah, I probably will build on that, and I'm not sure that I can answer all the questions, but that question on collapse is extremely important. I'm really often very skeptical of some. I think it was not embedded in the question, but some of the visions of very innovative local players that I see in France, at least, is that we don't need to take care about the global structures of the policy system because the system will collapse, and then their local innovation will prevail. And that's, for instance, when we look at the common agricultural policy, a policy that we were not able to reform to make it greener for 4 decades. These local players are saying, I'm tired of trying to change it, and anyway it will collapse, and so we need to build innovations, and we need to build the future in our local innovations. And I don't disagree on the fact that we need to build the futures in the seeds of the Anthropocene, as Oonsie was saying. This is really important. But the system will not collapse. Capitalism is very resilient, to just use the example of what Etienne was saying. There is this wonderful book by F. Capello on how capitalism is extremely well suited to just digest criticisms that are addressed to it and just make it part and just continue going. So there are ways through which we really need to think also how the dominant narratives, the dominant structures of the socio-technical regime need to be challenged and not just left as something that will collapse anyway. And that's, to me, another argument on the pragmatism side. But I completely concur with Oonsie that the collapse moment would be extremely dangerous in terms of inequality. I mean, morally completely unacceptable. So trying to prevent it, challenge it is, I think, extremely, extremely important. And I see also in the examples of socio-technical transitions that have been put on the table by the historians of socio-technical regimes, that there are very interesting disruptions that happen at moments where you can't really imagine it. And they are linking technologies like the AI that was mentioned, technologies that are very important because they structure everything, with political change in governance, ideology, etc. I mean, a lot of what Elvis has been saying is about how our ideologies have been changing on what it means to have. I mean, Mariana Mazzucato, to me, is not just a very good speaker and an excellent academic, but the way that she puts together transition management studies, scenario, I mean, she talks about her mission-oriented policy is about all the scenario thinking that Oonsie has been presenting. She links that with reinstallment of the necessity to have public policies and the role of the state, etc. So you see, to an extent, the world of ideas is also sometimes the element that changes the way that we look at things, and that has also very important impacts. So let's not wait for collapse. That's why let's try to prevent its most unequal and most unacceptable consequences. But let's also try and see how we could have disruptions rather than just wait for collapse to change the system.
Thank you, Sébastien. Elvis, do you want to add a word?
Yeah, absolutely. And I completely agree with Oonsie and Sébastien on this. And I think find ways of building flexibility into systems in ways in their systems rather than sort of a collapse of the systems. And I think that is also often quite important. But of course, there are cases where I would wish that there are radical collapse, but there are also cases that I would wish that without transformations. Sort of a mix of them, I think cases that sort of tend to be the better option. But of course, I don't actually think there are specific solutions. And I think that we need sort of views around some of these sort of.
Sorry, Elvis, could you repeat your last sentence? We lost you a little bit.
Oh, so I was saying that I think there are certain cases where sort of an incremental transformation might be an option, but of course there are also certain transformation is needed, even though the outcomes may not necessarily be known, right? So I think it often a try and error, and then we hope for the necessarily.
Okay, so we have a little bit trouble with your connection, but hopefully you will be more hearable in a few seconds. Do you have extra question in the room, Antoine?
Thank you, everyone, for the very interesting discussion and presentations. I have two questions, but you don't have to answer them. I just want to put the two of them, and you pick the one you like the best. So I mean, there's a lot of discussion here about collapse and crisis, and so we've seen how crises are necessary to induce institutional change, and I mean, this is the line of Perez and others, where you have this kind of feedback between the evolution of the production structure, the crisis, and then the evolution of the institutional sector. And so, but on the other hand, we want to avoid collapse, and so the question is, can we have a crisis without a collapse? so that we can have this transition, this institutional change, but without having to suffer too much? And is it like even ontologically possible, or do we actually need to have negative outcome to actually force the transition? One. Second question is, we didn't talk too much about finance in this presentation today, but the political discourse is really about mobilizing finance and so on and so forth. And so the question is, should we just concentrate on industrial policies and structural change, or what is the role of finance in this kind of dynamics, especially taking into consideration that the current version of finance is having very negative adverse relationship on the structure of the economies, especially in developing and emerging economies?
Okay, so I think we will end with these two questions. I don't see any more. Maybe Sébastien, you want to begin?
Yeah, but, I mean, the two questions are really interesting. I just wanted to really say, when we were talking about, and that's probably implicit in your question, Antoine, but the question about industrial policy is not just about state subsidies, innovation. It's also about how you channel the investments, the channel finance flows to the necessary investments, to the innovators, and not just to savings. And so there is a whole discussion about how you reallocate the flows of finance to make those industrial policies possible. One of the key elements, and that's this is not, I mean, I'm not a development economist like Elvis, so I will shut up very, very rapidly, but a lot of the challenge of the industrialization pathways in African countries is really to see how you can attract investments in those innovative pathways of industries that are mid to high tech or what types of technology. So this is probably something where we could have underlined that much more. Sorry, that's my main. But we should probably redo the conversation, including much more what we mean by finance in those contexts.
Thank you, Sébastien. Elvis, you want to pursue?
Yes, quickly. And I think that it's the role of finance, particularly in resolving in mitigating climate, that cannot be overemphasized, right? And we've seen over the last couple of COP discussions, a huge levels of discussion around finance. And then we do see also how how tricky some of the discussions are. Countries react when certain issues around finance are, and we've seen issues around the loss and damage fund coming as well, and then promises being made and not fulfilled as well. So I think the finance is important. As Sébastien said, not necessarily for resolving the climate crisis, but also in pursuing in industrial policy, in pursuing industrial development are also quite important. And I think that it wasn't intentional in any way to sort of omit it. It was implied in several others of the discussions.
Thank you, Elvis. Finally, you have the last word, Oonsie.
My last word can just be short, and yeah, I think also just saying I think finance is absolutely critical, and I think that's really coming out in very many sectors. And I think not just absolutely critical, it's also extremely challenging. I think at the moment maybe that's also one space where maybe there's almost the biggest blockages in terms of engaging with alternative ways of doing things. But I think from any kind of systems perspective, the way that this money is channeled and flows is fundamental to structuring the current system and the dynamics and spreading that in a different way. So I think a whole nother session on that would be, and more discussions there are critically needed. But thanks for a very engaging conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. We are coming to the end of this discussion, and thank you for showing that structural change is possible, is needed, that public policy is one pathway, but really driving, inspiring pathways, having the social construct we mentioned earlier on is very important. And thank you for giving example and food for thoughts. Thank you very much for the three speakers. Let's applaud them. Thank you very much.